The photograph trembled in Pearl Abbott's hands as the stranger's shadow fell across her porch, a silhouette cut sharp against the setting Arizona sun of 1875. She'd spent 5 years searching for a man who existed only in the sepia-toned image. She clutched a fabrication born of desperation and hope. "That picture you're holding," the dust-covered cowboy said, removing his hat to reveal sun-weathered features beneath a shock of sandy hair. "I reckon that man ain't real, madam," Pearl's breath caught. The stranger standing before her bore no resemblance to the photograph, yet something in his steady gaze made her pause. "And who might you be to make such a claim?" "Name's Xavier Zimmerman," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of miles traveled. "And I'm real enough to stay if you'll have me." Pearl tucked the photograph into her skirt pocket, years of disappointment making her wary. She'd come to Republic, Arizona, with nothing but dreams and that fabricated image, seeking someone who never existed. Now this man, trail-worn and forward, stood offering himself instead. "I don't know what you're selling, Mr. Zimmerman, but I'm not buying," she said, turning toward her door. "Not selling anything, madam." Xavier stepped no closer, respecting the invisible boundary of her porch steps. "Just offering honest work. Your property looks like it could use a hand." Pearl paused, her fingers on the door handle. The small ranch she'd inherited from a distant uncle had fallen into disrepair, too much for a woman alone to manage. The cattle were thin, the fences broken, and winter would be upon them before long. "1 week," she said finally, not looking back. "Room and board, fair wages. After that, we'll see." "That's all I ask," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice without turning. Pearl had learned the hard way that the West was unkind to women with dreams. She'd arrived in Republic 2 years prior, following her uncle's death, with city clothes and city ways that had earned her nothing but scorn from the townspeople. They'd wagered how long the Eastern lady would last before selling the struggling ranch and returning to Boston. The photograph had been her secret. A composite image created by a traveling photographer who specialized in future husbands for lonely women, combining handsome features that existed nowhere on a single man. Pearl had commissioned it during a moment of weakness, creating a fiction to share with the prying women of Republic. A fiancé who would arrive someday to help her tame this wild land. Now, watching from her window as Xavier unsaddled his horse in the yard, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The first day, Xavier repaired the sagging porch before Pearl finished her morning coffee. By midday, he'd mended the chicken coop and was eyeing the leaking roof. He worked with quiet efficiency, asking for direction but needing little instruction. "Where did you learn carpentry?" Pearl asked as she brought him water at noon. Xavier wiped his brow, revealing calloused hands that told their own story. "My father built houses in Tennessee before the war. I picked up what I could before heading west." "And what brought you west, Mr. Zimmerman?" He looked past her to the distant mountains. "Same as most, I suppose. Something to prove, something to find." His eyes returned to hers. "And you, Miss Abbott, this doesn't seem like your natural habitat." Pearl stiffened. "I don't see how that's your concern." "It isn't," he agreed easily. "But lonely people recognize their own kind." That evening, Pearl watched him from the kitchen window as he sat on the newly repaired porch steps, whittling a piece of wood in the fading light. The photograph burned in her pocket like a shameful secret. On the third day, Xavier rode out with Pearl to check the cattle. The small herd had dwindled to 30 head, many looking poor after the dry summer. "Your uncle kept records?" Xavier asked as they guided their horses across the sun-baked pasture. Pearl nodded. "In the study, though I've struggled to make sense of them." "I'd like to take a look if you don't mind. Might help determine how to build the herd back." Pearl studied him, this man who spoke of staying when everyone else in her life had mastered the art of leaving. "You talk as though you'll be here beyond the week." Xavier's eyes met hers steadily. "Would that be unwelcome?" The question hung between them, carried on the warm breeze. Pearl turned away. "That would depend on your intentions, Mr. Zimmerman." "Xavier," he corrected. "And my intentions are honest work for honest pay, nothing more presumptuous than that." That night, Pearl pulled out her uncle's ledgers. Xavier sat across from her at the kitchen table, his finger tracing the numbers with surprising comprehension. "Your uncle was robbed," he said finally, turning the ledger toward her. "These cattle sales, the prices are well below market, and these supply purchases are double what they should be." Pearl leaned forward, her shoulder nearly touching his. "How can you be certain?" "I worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas for 3 years. The numbers don't lie." He flipped through more pages. "And this name keeps appearing, Morton. Who is he?" Pearl's stomach tightened. "Clive Morton. He owns the mercantile in town and most of the land surrounding mine. He's been persistent about buying my property." Xavier's jaw tightened. "I'd wager he's been systematic about ensuring you'd have no choice but to sell. That's a serious accusation." "It's the simplest explanation for these numbers." Xavier closed the ledger. "With fair prices for your cattle and reasonable costs for supplies, this ranch could turn a profit." Pearl's hands trembled slightly. "I've tried dealing with other merchants, but none will cross Morton. He has the town in his pocket." "Then we go beyond Republic," Xavier said, as though the solution were simple. "The railroad's only 30 miles south. We drive your cattle there, sell direct to the buyers." Pearl raised an eyebrow. Xavier smiled, and for the first time, Pearl noticed the small crinkles at the corners of his eyes. "Figure of speech, unless you're offering to extend my employment." Pearl should have said no. She'd learned that men couldn't be trusted, especially handsome ones with easy smiles who appeared out of nowhere, but the alternative was losing everything she'd fought to keep. "The cattle need another month of grazing before they're fit to sell," she said cautiously. "I could use help until then." Xavier nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Then we have work to do." The following morning brought unexpected trouble. Pearl was collecting eggs when she heard approaching horses. Through the barn doorway, she saw 3 riders entering her property, Clive Morton at the lead. Pearl smoothed her apron and stepped out to meet them. Morton was a florid-faced man in his 50s, perpetually dressed as though for a business meeting in a much larger town than Republic. "Miss Abbott," he called with false cheer. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" "Mr. Morton," Pearl acknowledged coldly. "To what do I owe this visit?" Neighborly concern. Morton dismounted, revealing his substantial girth. "Word reached me you've taken on. Help." His eyes darted around the property. "In these parts, we like to know who's about." "My employment choices are my business," Pearl replied. Morton's smile thinned. "Everything in Republic is my business, Miss Abbott, especially when unvetted strangers appear in our community." "I believe the lady said her choices are her own." Xavier emerged from the barn, pitchfork in hand, his stance casual yet somehow commanding. Morton's men straightened in their saddles. "And you must be the drifter," Morton said, eyeing Xavier with undisguised contempt. "Got a name, boy?" "Xavier Zimmerman." He approached, stopping beside Pearl. "And I'm employed, not drifting," Morton snorted. "Same difference out here. Where you from, Zimmerman?" "All over. Most recently Kansas." "Kansas," Morton repeated skeptically. "Cattle country. Yet you choose to work a failing ranch for a woman who doesn't know a bull from a steer." Pearl bristled. "Mr. Morton, I choose honest work," Xavier interrupted calmly. "Something I suspect you might be unfamiliar with." Morton's face darkened. "Watch yourself, Cowboy. Republic isn't kind to men who don't understand their place." "Funny," Xavier replied. "I was about to say the same thing." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Morton forced a laugh and turned back to Pearl. "My offer still stands, Miss Abbott. Your land, fair price, before winter makes your decision for you." "I'm not selling," Pearl said firmly. Morton's eyes hardened. "We'll see." He mounted his horse with surprising agility for his size. "Everyone sells eventually." As the men rode away, Pearl released a shaky breath. "You shouldn't antagonize him." Xavier leaned the pitchfork against the fence. "Men like that feed on fear. Show none and they're half defeated already." "You don't understand what he's capable of," Pearl insisted. "I understand exactly what he's capable of," Xavier replied, his voice dropping. "I've seen his kind before. They take and take until someone stands against them." Pearl studied him, wondering what experiences had hardened this man who couldn't be more than 30. "And will you be that someone, Mr. Zimmerman? A drifter with no stake in this fight?" Something flashed in Xavier's eyes, pain, perhaps, or determination. Sometimes a man needs to stand for something, Miss Abbott, even if it isn't his fight to begin with. That night, Pearl couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, the photograph in her hands. The handsome, imaginary man stared back at her perfect features, perfect posture, perfectly unreal. She'd invented a story around him. A brave, educated gentleman who would arrive and solve all her problems with refinement and Eastern money. Xavier Zimmerman was nothing like her invention. He was sun-darkened and rough-edged, his hands calloused, his words spare. Yet in 3 days, he'd done more to secure her future than her fictional fiancé ever could. A sound drew her attention to the yard. Xavier stood by the corral in the moonlight, smoking a cigarette. Without conscious decision, Pearl wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. "Trouble sleeping?" she asked, approaching. Xavier extinguished his cigarette respectfully. "Just enjoying the quiet. City folk don't understand how loud silence can be out here." "I'm still learning to appreciate it," Pearl admitted, joining him at the fence. "In Boston, there was always noise, carriages, people, commerce. Here the silence feels honest," Xavier finished. When she hesitated, Pearl nodded. "Yes, honest." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the horses move like shadows in the corral. "The photograph," Xavier said finally. "The one you were holding when I arrived. May I ask about it?" Pearl tensed. "How did you know I was holding a photograph? You tucked it away when I approached. I saw the edge." He turned to face her. "And I saw how you looked at it, like it was both precious and painful." Pearl considered lying, then decided against it. This man had been nothing but straightforward with her. "It's a fabrication, a fantasy." She pulled the photograph from her pocket and handed it to him. Xavier studied it in the moonlight. "Handsome fellow, almost too perfect." "He is too perfect." "He doesn't exist," Pearl's voice caught. "A traveling photographer offered future husband portraits to unmarried women. For a price, he'd compose an image of what he called an ideal match. I was lonely, desperate for the townspeople to stop their prying questions about a woman alone." Xavier handed the photograph back. "So you invented a fiancé." "I told people he was coming to help with the ranch," Pearl admitted, shame coloring her voice. "That we'd been corresponding, that he had means to invest. It bought me time, respect, but it was a lie." "We all tell ourselves stories to survive," Xavier said quietly. "There's no shame in hope." Pearl looked up at him, surprised by his lack of judgment. "Even false hope, especially false hope, it's often all we have." He gestured to the land around them. The West was built on it. Gold that wasn't there, land too hard to tame, fortunes just over the next rise. "Is that what brought you west? False hope?" Xavier was quiet for so long Pearl thought he wouldn't answer. "I came west because there was nothing left for me back east. My family died in the war, father at Antietam, mother and sisters from typhoid in '64. I was 14, fighting on the wrong side of a lost cause." "I'm sorry," Pearl whispered. "Don't be, we all carry ghosts." Xavier looked toward the distant mountains. "I drifted west because the open country felt less empty than the places filled with memories." Pearl understood that sentiment more than she cared to admit. She'd come to Republic not just for her inheritance, but to escape the suffocating memories of Boston parents dead from influenza, a broken engagement to a man who couldn't bear the thought of a wife without substantial dowry. "What will you do when the cattle are sold?" she asked. Xavier shrugged. "Never been much for long-term planning. One day follows another." "You could stay," Pearl suggested before she could stop herself. "The ranch needs more than one person." "Is that an offer of partnership, Miss Abbott?" Pearl, she corrected. "And it's a possibility to consider." Xavier smiled, the moonlight catching the planes of his face. "I'll consider it, Pearl." For the first time in years, Pearl felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, not the false hope of her fabricated photograph, but something quieter and more substantial. She tucked the photograph away, suddenly less attached to the fiction it represented. The following weeks brought steady improvements to the ranch. Xavier repaired fences, doctored sick cattle, and constructed a new water trough that would resist freezing in the coming winter. Pearl found herself working alongside him, learning skills her uncle's foreman had never bothered to teach her. "You're a natural with the horses," Xavier commented one afternoon as Pearl expertly calmed a nervous mare. "I rode in Boston." she explained, stroking the horse's neck. Though side saddle, which is entirely impractical out here, Xavier chuckled. I noticed you adapted quickly. Pearl smiled, remembering the scandalized looks from Republic's proper ladies when she first appeared in town wearing split skirts for riding astride. Necessity is a powerful teacher. As are those determined to overcome obstacles, Xavier replied, his admiration evident. Such moments occurred with increasing frequency, small exchanges that revealed mutual respect growing between them. Pearl found herself sharing more about her past, and Xavier occasionally offered glimpses into his wandering years. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Xavier asked about her journey west. What made you decide to claim your uncle's property? Most Eastern women would have sold it sight unseen. Pearl sipped her coffee, considering. My uncle was my mother's brother. They were estranged most of my life. He left Boston before I was born. When my parents died, he wrote offering me a home here, but I was engaged then and declined. The engagement ended, Xavier asked carefully. Pearl nodded. Gordon was from a good family, but his fortunes depended on my dowry. When my parents' estate proved less substantial than expected, his ardor cooled considerably. His loss, Xavier said simply. Perhaps. In any case, when my uncle died 2 years later, leaving me this property, it felt like a second chance, a way to prove I could stand on my own. Pearl smiled ruefully. I had romantic notions about ranching. Reality proved considerably more difficult. Yet you stayed, Xavier observed. Most would have sold to Morton within months. Stubbornness runs in my family, Pearl admitted, and I refuse to be defeated, especially by a man like Morton. Xavier studied her with quiet appreciation. That quality will serve you well out here. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Xavier was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the pistol he carried. Stay here, he said, stepping off the porch. Pearl ignored the instruction, following him into the yard. 3 riders approached, none of them Morton or his men. As they drew closer, Pearl recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Taylor from Republic. Evening, Miss Abbott, the sheriff called, reining in his horse. Mr. Zimmerman. He nodded to Xavier with barely concealed hostility. Sheriff, Pearl acknowledged. What brings you out this way? Sheriff Taylor dismounted, his deputies remaining on horseback. Got a telegraph from Kansas City asking about a Xavier Zimmerman. His eyes fixed on Xavier. Seems there's some interest in your whereabouts. Xavier's expression remained neutral. Is that so? Care to explain why the authorities in Kansas might be looking for you? The sheriff's hand rested near his sidearm. Pearl looked at Xavier, unease growing in her stomach. He'd been forthright about coming from Kansas, but had shared little about his time there. I worked cattle drives for the Clayton outfit, Xavier said calmly. Left on good terms 3 months ago. Can't imagine why anyone would be asking after me. The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his vest. Telegraph mentions a dispute with a banker named Phillips. Says you threatened him before disappearing. Xavier's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Phillips was cheating the drovers out of their pay. I called him on it publicly, that's all. That true? The sheriff looked skeptical. Ask any man who rode with Clayton's outfit, Xavier replied evenly. Phillips was shorting every drover $5 a head, claiming market prices had dropped when they hadn't. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. I've got no warrant, so I can't compel you to do anything. But folks in Republic are already talking. Morton's been spreading word you might be a wanted man. Pearl stepped forward. Mr. Zimmerman has been nothing but honest and hardworking since his arrival. Whatever happened in Kansas, with respect, Miss Abbott, the sheriff interrupted, you barely know this man. I'd advise caution in who you defend. Xavier placed a gentle hand on Pearl's arm. It's all right. He addressed the sheriff directly. Tell whoever's asking that I'm here, working honest employment. If they want to speak with me, they can find me at the Abbott Ranch. The sheriff nodded, though his expression remained suspicious. I'll pass that along, but I'm watching you, Zimmerman. Republic's a peaceful town. I aim to keep it that way. After the sheriff and his deputies departed, Pearl turned to Xavier. You never mentioned trouble in Kansas. Xavier sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. It wasn't trouble worth mentioning. Phillips was a crooked banker working with the cattle buyers. When I discovered the scheme and confronted him, he threatened to have me arrested. I decided to move on rather than fight a battle I couldn't win. And now, Pearl asked quietly. Now that battle has followed me, Xavier said grimly. I'm sorry to bring this to your doorstep, Pearl. If you want me to leave, no, Pearl said firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. Morton is behind this, I'm certain of it. He's trying to drive you away before we can sell the cattle. Xavier studied her with surprise. You believe me then? I've seen enough of your character these past weeks to know you're not a criminal, Pearl replied, and I know Morton well enough to recognize his handiwork. Relief crossed Xavier's features. Thank you for that trust, it's uncommon in my experience. Pearl realized with sudden clarity how few people in her life she had genuinely trusted. Her parents, perhaps, certainly not her former fiancé. The revelation that she trusted this man she'd known barely a month should have frightened her, but instead it felt like finding solid ground after years of uncertainty. We should move up our timeline, Xavier suggested. Get the cattle to market before Morton can cause more trouble. Pearl nodded. Can they travel now? You said they needed more time. Some are still underweight, but most will fetch a fair price, Xavier explained. Better to sell now than risk Morton finding more creative ways to interfere. They spent the evening planning the cattle drive. Though the railroad was only 30 miles away, the journey would take at least 3 days with the herd. Xavier sent a letter to a former riding companion who lived near Republic, asking for help with the drive. 2 men and 1 woman can manage 30 head if the cattle are cooperative, Xavier explained as they studied a map by lamplight, but an extra hand would make the difference if trouble arises. You trust this man? Pearl asked. With my life, Xavier affirmed. Daniel Hawkins rode with me for 2 seasons. He's settled now with a small spread about 10 miles east. 3 days later, Daniel arrived a quiet, dark-haired man with a ready smile and capable hands. He greeted Xavier with a bare hug and tipped his hat respectfully to Pearl. Madam, Xavier's letter said you've been holding your own against that jackal Morton. Admirable feat. Pearl found herself warming to Daniel immediately. Mr. Zimmerman exaggerates my fortitude, but I appreciate the sentiment. Daniel winked at Xavier. She even talks fancy, just like you said. Xavier's cheeks colored slightly. We should check the herd before sundown. As the men rode out to the pasture, Pearl wondered what else Xavier might have said about her. The thought that he discussed her at all, let alone admiringly, sent an unexpected warmth through her. The evening before their departure, Pearl found herself restless. The cattle were gathered in the near pasture, ready for the morning drive. Supplies were packed, the route planned. Yet anxiety kept her pacing the house until she finally stepped outside for air. She found Xavier by the barn, checking the pack saddles one final time. Can't sleep either, he asked without looking up. Too much riding on tomorrow, Pearl admitted, joining him. Xavier straightened, his face shadowed in the lantern light. We'll get your cattle to market, Pearl. I promise you that. And after? The question had been circling her mind for days. Xavier set down the saddle strap he'd been adjusting. After depends on many things. Such as, Pearl pressed. Such as whether there's reason for me to stay, he said carefully, his eyes meeting hers. Pearl's heart quickened. I thought we'd discussed the ranch needing help. We did. Xavier stepped closer. But I'm asking if there might be more than the ranch that interests me here. The honesty of his words stole Pearl's breath. No man had ever spoken to her with such direct intention, not her former fiancé with his calculated courtship, certainly not the fabricated man in her photograph. There might be, she answered softly, but I've learned to be cautious with my hopes. Xavier nodded, understanding in his gaze. Then let's get your cattle to market first, the rest we'll have time to discover. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for moving cattle. Daniel took the lead position, Xavier the flank, while Pearl rode drag, keeping stragglers moving. The herd moved well, following the lead steer down the familiar trail toward the valley. By midday, they'd covered nearly 10 miles without incident. Pearl felt a growing confidence as they stopped to water the cattle at a stream. This might actually succeed. Looking good, Daniel commented, riding back from his scouting position. Another hour and we'll reach the Mesa crossing. After that, it's easy travel to the railroad. Xavier nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon continuously. Let's keep moving. I'd like to make it past the Mesa before nightfall. They resumed the drive, the cattle settling into a steady rhythm. Pearl found herself enjoying the work despite its difficulty. There was something deeply satisfying about moving across the land with purpose, guiding animals that represented her future security. As they approached the Mesa, Xavier rode back to Pearl's position. Stay alert through this narrow section, he warned. The cattle could spook easily here. Pearl nodded, adjusting her hat against the late afternoon sun. I've noticed you watching the ridgelines. Are you expecting trouble? Xavier's expression was grim. Morton knows what we're doing. This would be the ideal place for interference. You think he'd actually sabotage the drive? Pearl asked, though she already knew the answer. Men like Morton don't accept defeat gracefully, Xavier replied. Just stay close and keep your rifle handy. The Mesa Passage was a natural bottleneck, a narrow trail between rising rock walls that provided the easiest route through the otherwise steep terrain. The cattle moved through single file, their pace slowing as the path narrowed. Pearl was guiding the last few stragglers when she heard a rifle crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Ahead, she saw Xavier wheel his horse around, drawing his pistol as he scanned the ridgeline. Another shot rang out, this one striking the ground near the lead cattle. The herd bellowed in alarm, the front animals turning back in panic. Stampede! Daniel shouted as the cattle began surging back down the narrow trail. Pearl found herself facing a wall of frightened animals charging directly toward her. Xavier appeared suddenly beside her, his horse pushing against hers. Move to the side wall. He shouted above the thunder of hooves and panicked mooing. Together they forced their horses to the edge of the trail as the cattle streamed past, dust billowing around them. Pearl clung to her saddle, her heart pounding as she pressed against the rock face. When the last of the cattle had passed, Xavier grabbed her reins. Stay here! He spurred his horse forward, disappearing into the dust cloud. Pearl's instinct was to follow, but wisdom held her back. Instead, she dismounted, rifle in hand, and scrambled up the side of the canyon to gain a better vantage point from her elevated position. She could see the scattered cattle below, running in chaotic patterns across the valley floor. Daniel was working furiously to contain them on one side, while Xavier had circled to cut off their retreat toward the ranch. Movement on the opposite ridge caught Pearl's attention. Two riders were making a hasty retreat from positions overlooking the trail. She raised her rifle, though they were well beyond effective range. One man looked back, and even at this distance, Pearl recognized Morton's distinctive profile. By nightfall, they had managed to recover most of the herd. 3 cattle were lost to injuries, and one had disappeared entirely. They made camp in a defensive position, backs to a rocky outcropping that prevented approach from behind. Morton's getting desperate, Daniel observed as they sat around the small fire. Risking open sabotage like this, Xavier nodded grimly. He wants the land badly enough to show his hand. But why? Pearl wondered. My property isn't particularly valuable compared to his other holdings. Xavier and Daniel exchanged glances. What aren't you telling me? Pearl demanded. Xavier sighed. There's talk that the railroad's planning a spur line through this territory within the year. Land prices will soar when that happens. Pearl stared at him. How long have you known this? Since Daniel arrived, Xavier admitted. He heard it from traders passing through. And you didn't think to share this information with me? Pearl felt her temper rising. I wanted to confirm it first, Xavier explained. False rumors about railroad expansions are common out here. Morton could be operating on speculation rather than fact. Pearl stood, needing distance to process this revelation. If it's true, my ranch sits directly in the path between Republic and the main line, making it extremely valuable, Daniel agreed, especially to a man who already owns most of Republic. Pearl walked away from the fire, trying to calm her thoughts. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright, a reminder of how small her problems were in the grand scheme. Yet to her, they were everything. She felt rather than heard Xavier approach, his footsteps deliberately audible to avoid startling her. I should have told you immediately, he said quietly. I apologize for withholding information that affects your future. Pearl turned to face him. Yes, you should have. Her anger had cooled to disappointment. I thought we were partners in this endeavor. We are, Xavier insisted. But I've spent years watching people lose everything chasing railroad rumors. I didn't want you making decisions based on information that might prove false. Pearl studied his face in the moonlight, searching for deception and finding only genuine concern. You're protecting me. Trying to, Xavier admitted, though I'm beginning to understand you need no man's protection. Despite her lingering frustration, Pearl felt a smile tug at her lips. I appreciate the sentiment, if not the execution. In the future, I'd prefer honesty even if the truth is uncertain. Xavier nodded solemnly. You have my word. They stood in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the desert surrounding them. Pearl was acutely aware of Xavier's presence, his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the respectful distance he maintained. What happens after the cattle are sold? She asked, echoing their earlier conversation. Xavier's eyes held her steadily. If the railroad rumors are true, your ranch will be worth fighting for. Morton won't give up easily. That's not what I asked, Pearl said softly. Xavier stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. After the cattle are sold, I'd like to return with you, not just as a ranch hand, but as, Pearl prompted when he hesitated. As a man who's found something worth staying for, Xavier finished, his voice low. If that's welcome. Pearl had spent years guarding her heart, first from the pain of her parents' deaths, then from her fiancé's betrayal. The photograph of the imaginary man had been a shield away to avoid real connection while maintaining the illusion of future happiness. Yet here stood a real man, imperfect and honest, offering not promises of rescue but partnership in whatever came next. It would be welcome, Pearl whispered, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed Xavier's weathered face. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle as he raised it to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that spoke of respect rather than presumption. The moment was brief but profound, a promise made without words. They returned to the campfire together, where Daniel pretended not to notice the change between them. The following day brought fresh challenges. Moving the cattle across open country proved difficult, as the animals remained skittish after the previous day's stampede. By mid-afternoon, however, they caught sight of smoke from the railroad town of Silver Springs. We'll arrive by dusk, Xavier predicted. The cattle buyer I know usually stays until the evening train departs. Pearl nodded, excitement building. How much do you think they'll bring? Xavier calculated quickly. Even with the lost animals, you should clear enough to keep the ranch running comfortably through winter, with some left for improvements. The prospect of financial security, even temporary, lifted a weight Pearl hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, she might not need to count every penny and worry about each unexpected expense. Silver Springs proved to be little more than a collection of buildings surrounding the train station, a hotel, saloon, general store, and a few houses. But to Pearl, it represented salvation. Xavier led them directly to the cattle pens beside the tracks, where a broad-shouldered man in a business suit was examining another herd. Jefferson, Xavier called, dismounting, still robbing honest ranchers blind. The man turned, his stern face breaking into a grin. Zimmerman, you sorry excuse for a cowhand, thought you drifted to California by now. The men shook hands vigorously, their banter suggesting a long-standing relationship. Miss Abbott, this is Howard Jefferson, the most honest cattle buyer west of the Mississippi, which isn't saying much. Xavier winked at Pearl. Howard, this is Miss Pearl Abbott, owner of these fine cattle. Jefferson removed his hat respectfully. Madam. Unusual to see a lady in the cattle business. Necessity breeds adaptation, Mr. Jefferson, Pearl replied smoothly. I trust you'll offer a fair price despite my gender. Jefferson chuckled. Any friend of Zimmerman's gets my best offer, regardless of gender. He turned to examine the cattle. Though these look a bit rough around the edges. Drought year, Xavier explained, but they're sound stock, good breeding lines. Jefferson walked the perimeter of the herd, evaluating each animal with a practiced eye. "I can give you $38 a head." Pearl knew from Xavier's lessons that this was slightly below market rate, but fair considering the condition of her cattle. Still, negotiation was expected. 42 would be closer to their value, she countered. Jefferson raised an eyebrow, glancing at Xavier. "She drives a hard bargain." "She knows her cattle's worth," Xavier replied with evident pride. Jefferson considered. $40 even, and I'll take the lot today. Otherwise, you'll need to wait for the buyer coming through on Thursday's train." Pearl extended her hand. "40 it is, Mr. Jefferson." As they completed the transaction in Jefferson's office above the saloon, Pearl felt a surge of triumph. The total sum over $1,000 would transform her circumstances completely. "I've taken the liberty of wiring ahead to the Republic Bank," Jefferson explained as he counted out the money. "They'll expect you when you return." Pearl frowned. "I'd prefer not to deposit this in Republic. Mr. Morton has considerable influence there." Jefferson nodded, understanding. "Wise precaution. The bank in Prescott is larger and more independent if you don't mind the extra travel." Prescott it is, Pearl decided. The territorial capital was further away but offered greater security from Morton's influence. After concluding their business, they secured rooms at the small hotel. Pearl luxuriated in a proper bath, her first in months, while the men saw to the horses. Clean and refreshed, Pearl found herself examining her reflection in the spotted mirror. The woman who stared back bore little resemblance to the Boston society lady who'd arrived in Arizona 2 years prior. Her face was tanned, her hands roughened by work. Yet she looked stronger, more confident than the pale, uncertain creature she'd been. A knock at her door interrupted her reflections. She opened it to find Xavier, freshly bathed and shaved, his usually unruly hair combed neatly. "Daniel and I thought you might join us for dinner," he said. "The hotel dining room isn't fancy, but it's better than trail food." Pearl smiled. "I'd be delighted. Give me a moment." She changed into her one good dress, a practical blue cotton saved for rare trips to town, and joined the men downstairs. The hotel dining room was indeed modest, but after days of camp cooking, the simple meal of roast beef and potatoes seemed luxurious. As they ate, Daniel regaled them with tales of their cattle driving days, revealing a side of Xavier that Pearl had only glimpsed. "This fool once rode into a lightning storm to turn back a runaway steer," Daniel recounted, gesturing with his fork. "Said it was worth the risk since the boss would dock our pay if we lost even one head." Xavier shook his head, embarrassment evident. "I was younger then, and considerably less wise. You've always had more courage than sense," Daniel replied good-naturedly. "Like that time in Dodge City when you stood up to those Texas drovers who were harassing the laundry girl." "Someone needed to," Xavier said simply. Pearl watched him, seeing how these stories revealed his character, a man who consistently stood for what he believed right, regardless of personal cost. It explained much about his confrontation with the banker in Kansas and his willingness to help her against Morton. After dinner, Daniel excused himself to sample the local establishment's whiskey, leaving Pearl and Xavier alone. They walked outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the stuffy dining room. "What will you do with your newfound wealth?" Xavier asked as they strolled along the quiet street. Pearl had given this considerable thought. First, proper repairs to the house before winter, then perhaps some breeding stock in the spring to improve the herd. "Sensible investments," Xavier approved. "Though perhaps you might consider one frivolous purchase to celebrate your success," Pearl laughed. "What would you suggest?" Xavier considered. "A proper side saddle, since you mentioned riding that way in Boston." Or perhaps, he hesitated, then forged ahead, "a new photograph to replace the one you carry." Pearl stopped walking, surprised by the suggestion. "You think I need another fabrication?" Xavier shook his head, turning to face her. "I think you deserve a real image of someone who exists. Someone who intends to stay." The implication hung between them, charged with meaning. Pearl found herself unable to look away from his earnest gaze. "Xavier," she began, then found herself at a loss for words. He saved her from the silence, offering his arm to resume their walk. "Just a thought, Pearl," No pressure intended. They continued in companionable silence until they reached the small garden behind the hotel, little more than a patch of struggling roses and a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. They sat together, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Tell me about Boston," Xavier requested. "I've never been further east than St. Louis." Pearl described the city of her birth, the cobblestone streets, the common with its grand elm trees, the harbor filled with ships from around the world. As she spoke, she realized how distant that life now seemed, like a story she'd read rather than lived. "Do you miss it?" Xavier asked. Pearl considered the question carefully. "I miss certain comforts, hot water on demand, fresh oysters, museums and concerts." She smiled ruefully. "But I don't miss who I was there, constrained by expectations, defined by my family's position rather than my own choices." "And who are you here?" Xavier's question was gentle but probing. Pearl turned to him, moonlight silvering his features. "I'm still discovering that. But I know I'm stronger than I believed possible, more capable, less concerned with appearances." "I'd say you've found yourself rather well," Xavier observed. "Most who come west never manage that feat." "What about you?" Pearl asked. "Who is Xavier Zimmerman beyond the drifting cowboy?" Xavier leaned back, his face thoughtful. "For years, I've been defined by movement, always heading somewhere else, never arriving. That suited me after the war, after losing my family. Attachment meant potential loss. And now," Pearl's heart quickened at the vulnerability in his admission. "Now I find myself thinking about roots," he said quietly, "about what it might mean to belong somewhere, to someone." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Pearl knew they stood at a crossroads. She could retreat to safety or step forward into unknown territory with this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to an unvoiced prayer. "I've carried that photograph as a shield," she admitted. "A way to keep people at a distance while pretending I wasn't alone." Xavier nodded, understanding. "We all find ways to protect ourselves. But shields also prevent us from truly connecting," Pearl continued, finding courage in the darkness. I think I'm ready to set mine down." Xavier's hand found hers on the bench between them, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Pearl Abbott, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever encountered." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her gently, briefly, a question rather than a demand. When he pulled back, Pearl found herself following, unwilling to break the connection. Her second kiss was more assured, her free hand rising to touch his face. When they finally separated, Xavier's smile was visible even in the dim light. "I've wanted to do that since you stood up to Morton on your porch," Pearl laughed softly. "That long, and here I thought my charms were more recently appreciated." "I'm a patient man," Xavier replied, squeezing her hand. "Some treasures are worth waiting for." They returned to the hotel hand in hand, pausing at Pearl's door. Xavier raised her fingers to his lips in the same respectful gesture from the previous night. "Sleep well, Pearl. Tomorrow we head home." The word home resonated through Pearl with unexpected force. For the first time since leaving Boston, the ranch truly felt like home, not just a property she was struggling to maintain, but a place of belonging. The journey back to Republic was considerably easier without cattle to drive. Daniel accompanied them for the first day before branching off toward his own property, extracting promises from both to visit soon. "Take care of each other," he said meaningfully as they parted ways, "and send word if Morton causes more trouble. I'm handy in a fight." Pearl and Xavier traveled at a comfortable pace, making camp beside a stream as evening approached. After tending the horses, Xavier built a small fire while Pearl prepared a simple meal from their supplies. "I've been thinking," Xavier said as they ate beneath the spreading branches of a cottonwood tree. "About the railroad rumors." Pearl nodded. "I've been considering the implications as well. If the spur line comes through, your land will become valuable for more than just ranching," Xavier continued. "You could sell a portion for the right-of-way and still have plenty for cattle." "Assuming Morton doesn't find a way to force me out before then," Pearl replied. Xavier's expression grew serious. "That's what concerns me. He's already shown he's willing to take drastic measures. With the cattle sold, he may become even more desperate." "What do you suggest?" "We need allies," Xavier explained. Morton's influence in Republic depends on people's fear and isolation. If enough ranchers and townsfolk stand together, his power diminishes. Pearl considered this strategy. Most avoid crossing him. How do we convince them it's worth the risk? Self-interest is a powerful motivator, Xavier said. If the railroad comes, everyone benefits from fair dealing, not just Morton controlling everything. We start with Daniel and others who already resent Morton's grip on the region. Their conversation continued as darkness fell, planning and strategizing until the fire burned low. As they prepared their bedrolls on opposite sides of the dying embers, Pearl found herself reluctant to end the day. "Xavier," she called softly as he was about to turn in. "Yes." Pearl hesitated, then spoke from her heart. "I'm glad you're the one who arrived on my porch, not the man in that photograph." Even in the dim firelight, she could see his smile. "So am I, Pearl, more than I can express." They reached the ranch the following afternoon to find everything as they had left it, a relief, after half expecting Morton to have taken advantage of their absence. Xavier insisted on riding the property boundaries to ensure nothing had been tampered with while Pearl settled back into the house. In her bedroom, Pearl removed the photograph from the drawer where she'd stored it before their journey. The handsome, fictional face stared back at her, perfect and perfectly meaningless. Without ceremony, she tore it in half, then quarters, feeling no regret as she discarded the pieces. The real man who had entered her life offered something the fabrication never could: partnership founded on mutual respect and growing affection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Xavier returned at sunset, reporting all was well with the property. Over dinner, they discussed plans for the coming days: repairs to be made, supplies to be purchased in Prescott when they deposited the cattle money. "I thought we might look for a proper camera while in Prescott," Xavier suggested casually, "if you're interested in new photographs." Pearl smiled, understanding his meaning. "I believe I am, very interested indeed." The following week brought a flurry of activity. They traveled to Prescott, where Pearl deposited most of the cattle money in the territorial bank, keeping enough for immediate needs. As Xavier had suggested, they visited a photography studio, where they posed together for a formal portrait, Pearl seated, Xavier standing beside her with his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Something to show the good people of Republic," Xavier said with a wink as they left the studio, their photograph promised for delivery within the month. Their return trip included stops at several neighboring ranches, where Xavier introduced the topic of Morton's influence and the potential railroad development. Some ranchers were receptive, others more cautious, but seeds were planted that might later grow into alliance. As they approached Republic on their final day of travel, Pearl felt a newfound confidence. With money in the bank, the ranch secure for winter, and Xavier by her side, her future seemed brighter than at any point since arriving in Arizona. The town appeared unchanged as they rode down the main street, the general store, saloon, and small bank forming the heart of Republic. Several townsfolk nodded greetings, their curiosity about Pearl and Xavier's relationship evident in their glances. They stopped at the general store for supplies, deliberately avoiding Morton's larger establishment. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Holloway, welcomed them warmly. "Miss Abbott, we've heard your cattle drive was successful. Congratulations." Pearl thanked her, selecting items from the shelves. "We're grateful it went smoothly despite some interference." Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice. "Everyone's talking about Morton's men trying to sabotage your herd. Not everyone approves of such tactics, you should know." This was encouraging news. Perhaps Morton wasn't as universally supported as he appeared. As they completed their purchases, the door opened to reveal Sheriff Taylor. He nodded to them, his expression guarded. "Miss Abbott, Mr. Zimmerman, a word if you don't mind." They followed him outside, where he led them a short distance from the store. "Received another telegraph about you, Zimmerman," the sheriff said without preamble. "This one from a Judge Clayton in Kansas City." Xavier straightened. "Judge Clayton." "That would be Richard Clayton, the cattle baron I worked for," the sheriff nodded. "He confirms your story about the banker Phillips, says you were in the right, and Phillips has since been removed from his position for multiple instances of fraud." Relief flooded Xavier's features. I'm glad to hear justice was served, even belatedly. Clayton also mentioned you're one of the finest cattle hands he ever employed, the sheriff added grudgingly, said he'd hire you back in an instant. Please thank the judge for his kind words when you reply, Xavier said. The sheriff studied him for a moment. Seems I misjudged you, Zimmerman. Morton was quite convincing about your supposed criminal activities. Morton has his own agenda, Pearl interjected, one that rarely aligns with truth. Sheriff Taylor shifted uncomfortably. Be that as it may, I enforce the law equally for everyone in my jurisdiction, including Morton should evidence of wrongdoing emerge. He tipped his hat and departed, his message delivered. Xavier watched him go, a thoughtful expression on his face. That's the closest thing to an apology a lawman ever offers. And a veiled invitation to bring evidence against Morton, Pearl added. The sheriff might be more independent than we realized. Their optimism was short-lived. As they rode out of town, they noticed dust rising from the direction of Pearl's ranch. Riders, Xavier said grimly, urging his horse to a faster pace. They crested the final hill to find Morton and 5 men at Pearl's gate. Smoke rose from the far pasture where dry grass had been set ablaze. Fire, Pearl gasped, spurring her horse forward. Xavier grabbed her reins, stopping her charge. Wait, that's what they want to separate us. Morton saw them and smiled, raising his hand in mocking greeting. Miss Abbott, Mr. Zimmerman, what fortunate timing. We were just discussing the unfortunate accident on your property. They approached cautiously, Xavier positioning himself slightly ahead of Pearl. Accidents don't typically involve 6 mounted men, Morton, Xavier replied coldly. Morton affected surprise. We were passing by and noticed the blaze. Naturally, we stopped to offer assistance. The fire was spreading, though not rapidly in the sparse grass. Still, if it reached the wooded area beyond, it could become dangerous. Your concern is noted, Pearl said tightly. Now please leave my property while we address the fire. Morton made no move to depart. Actually, Miss Abbott, I came with a purpose. In light of these dangerous conditions, drought, fire hazards, potential cattle theft, I'm prepared to increase my offer for your land. A generous 20% above my previous figure. Pearl stared at him incredulously. You set fire to my pasture to demonstrate it's unsafe, then offer to buy it. Morton's expression hardened. Careful with accusations, Miss Abbott. Fire happens naturally in drought conditions. Like stampedes happen naturally in narrow canyons, Xavier asked pointedly. One of Morton's men shifted nervously in his saddle, glancing at his employer. I've had enough of your interference, Zimmerman, Morton snapped. This is business between Miss Abbott and myself. My answer remains the same, Mr. Morton, Pearl said firmly. The ranch is not for sale, not at your previous offer, not at this one, not at any price. Morton's face flushed with anger. You're making a grave mistake, Miss Abbott. A woman alone can't hope to succeed here, especially with unfortunate incidents multiplying. She's not alone, Xavier stated, his hand resting near his sidearm. And the next unfortunate incident might find you explaining yourself to Sheriff Taylor. Morton studied them for a long moment, calculation evident in his eyes. This isn't finished, he said finally. Not by far, he turned his horse. Come, gentlemen, Miss Abbott prefers to handle her fire without our assistance. As they rode away, Pearl and Xavier hurried to extinguish the blaze. Fortunately, the fire had been set where it would create impressive smoke, but do minimal damage. With shovels and blankets, they managed to contain it within an hour. Exhausted and smoke-stained, they returned to the house as dusk fell. He's escalating, Xavier observed grimly as they washed at the pump. Setting fires crosses into dangerous territory. Pearl nodded, fear mixing with determination. What's our next move? Xavier considered. We accelerate our plan to build alliances. And we gather evidence of Morton's tactics, something concrete the sheriff can't ignore. How do we prove he's behind these incidents? Pearl asked. Xavier smiled grimly. Men like Morton don't do their own dirty work. His hired hands are the weak link, especially that nervous one who couldn't meet our eyes when we mentioned the stampede. Over the following days, they divided their efforts. Pearl rode to neighboring ranches, particularly those owned by women or elderly men who might feel vulnerable to Morton's pressure. Xavier focused on repairs to the ranch, always with an eye towards security. They discovered that Morton had been systematically acquiring properties throughout the region, often through questionable means. Several ranchers reported mysterious cattle deaths, damaged water sources, or threatening visits similar to what Pearl had experienced. "He's building an empire," Xavier explained as they reviewed their findings one evening. "If the railroad comes through, he'll control most of the usable land between Republic and the main line. Unless enough people stand against him," Pearl added. Their campaign gathered momentum slowly but steadily. Daniel Hawkins introduced them to other independent ranchers who resented Morton's growing influence. Mrs. Holloway from the general store provided information about Morton's business dealings, including rumors that he'd forced the previous store owner into debt before acquiring the establishment. 2 weeks after the fire incident, they received an unexpected visitor, Sheriff Taylor, riding alone to the ranch in late afternoon. "Miss Abbott," he greeted her formally. "Mr. Zimmerman, I've come on official business." They invited him inside, where he declined refreshment, preferring to stand. "I've received multiple reports about Morton's activities," the sheriff began, his expression troubled, "including accusations of threats, property damage, and market manipulation. Ordinarily, I'd consider such claims difficult to prove. But," Xavier prompted when the sheriff paused, "but one of Morton's men came to me yesterday." Sheriff Taylor removed his hat, revealing his discomfort with the situation. "Fellow named Jenkins. Says he participated in starting the fire here and causing your stampede during the cattle drive. He's prepared to testify against Morton." Pearl exchanged a surprised glance with Xavier. "What prompted this change of heart?" "Conscience, partly," the sheriff replied, "but mostly fear. Morton apparently threatened Jenkins when he suggested the tactics were becoming too extreme. Jenkins believes Morton would eliminate him if he became a liability." Xavier nodded, understanding. "Smart assessment. Men like Morton don't leave loose ends." "I'm placing Jenkins in protective custody," Sheriff Taylor continued. "His testimony, combined with statements from affected ranchers, should be sufficient for territorial authorities to investigate Morton properly." Hope surged through Pearl. "You mean it's over?" The sheriff replaced his hat. "Not quite, Miss Abbott. Legal proceedings take time, but Morton's influence is waning. When word spread that I was collecting statements against him, several townspeople came forward with their own accounts of intimidation." After the sheriff departed, promising to keep them informed of developments, Pearl sat heavily in her uncle's old chair. "I can hardly believe it," she murmured. "After 2 years of Morton's shadow hanging over everything, to think it might actually lift." Xavier knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You stood your ground when most would have surrendered. That courage inspired others to find their own." Pearl smiled, squeezing his hands. "We stood our ground. I couldn't have done this alone." "No one should have to face such battles alone," Xavier replied softly. In that moment, looking into his eyes, Pearl knew with absolute certainty that she never wanted to face any battle or celebration without this man beside her. "Xavier," she began, her heart pounding, "when you arrived here, you said you were real enough to stay. Did you mean that?" "Every word," he answered without hesitation. "Though I couldn't have imagined then how deeply I would come to care for both this place and its remarkable owner." Pearl took a deep breath. "I've been independent my whole life by circumstance, if not by choice. I thought that was the only way I could prove my worth." Xavier waited, patient as always, as she gathered her thoughts. "But these past weeks have shown me that true strength often comes from connection, not isolation." Pearl met his gaze steadily. "I don't want to stand alone anymore. I want a partner, a husband, if that's something you might consider." Joy blazed across Xavier's face. "Pearl Abbott, I've been considering little else since that night in Silver Springs." He rose, drawing her to her feet. "I would be honored beyond words to be your husband, to build a life with you here." Their kiss sealed the proposal, no longer tentative but full of promise and shared dreams. When they finally separated, Pearl laughed with the sheer happiness of the moment. "A real man is infinitely preferable to a photograph," she declared, Xavier chuckled, his arms still around her waist. I should hope so, considering the photograph couldn't fix fences or drive cattle. The following months brought transformation to both the ranch and Republic itself. Jenkins' testimony, combined with evidence from multiple sources, led to Morton's arrest on charges of fraud, intimidation, and property damage. Though he maintained his innocence, many of his assets were frozen pending trial, significantly diminishing his influence. The railroad rumors proved true. Surveyors arrived in January to map the planned spur line, which would indeed pass near Pearl's property. As Xavier had predicted, she was able to sell a small portion of her least productive land for the right-of-way at a handsome price, while retaining the heart of the ranch. Pearl and Xavier married in a simple ceremony at the ranch that spring, with Daniel Hawkins standing as best man and Mrs. Holloway helping Pearl prepare. The photograph from Prescott, now framed and displayed prominently in their home, showed them as they truly were, partners facing the world together. As Republic grew with the coming of the railroad, Pearl and Xavier's ranch prospered. They expanded their herd with quality breeding stock, built a new barn, and added comfortable rooms to the house. Xavier's knowledge of cattle and Pearl's head for business proved a formidable combination. On their first anniversary, Xavier presented Pearl with a special gift, a handcrafted wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find the torn fragments of her fabricated photograph, carefully arranged but unrepaired. "A reminder," Xavier explained, "of how sometimes what we think we want isn't nearly as wonderful as what we actually need." Pearl closed the box, setting it aside to embrace her very real husband. "I never needed a perfect man in a photograph," she whispered, "just one real enough to stay." "And I'll be staying," Xavier promised, "for all the years to come." Years later, visitors to the prosperous Zimmerman Ranch in Republic, Arizona would often remark on the striking couple who had built one of the territory's most successful cattle operations. Few knew the story of the fabricated photograph, or the cowboy who had arrived in its place, a tale Pearl sometimes shared with their children on winter evenings beside the fire. Their eldest daughter, Catherine, once asked why her mother had kept the fragments of the torn photograph rather than discarding them completely. "Because, my dear," Pearl explained, "they remind me that sometimes our greatest disappointments lead us to our greatest joys. I thought I needed the perfect man from that picture, but what I truly needed was your father, real, imperfect, and absolutely right for me." As the railroad brought progress and growth to the Arizona Territory, Pearl and Xavier Zimmerman remained anchored in the life they had built together, a legacy of love that had begun with a false image, and a cowboy who proved reality could surpass even the most carefully crafted dreams.